What happens when scientists get it wrong? Like the Earth being flat,
Or the sun rotating around the Earth.
or things just spontaneously popping up.
That's what we're going to talk about today, the idea of spontaneous generation and the scientists that got it wrong.
For thousands of years, people believed that life just sprang up, such as the moss on the tree, molds in cheeses, and maggots in meat.
So when we talk about spontaneous generation, the first person we have to start with is Aristotle, which is a name that you should have heard. Aristotle was a famous ancient Greek philosopher and scientist who influenced a lot of Western thought. Specifically, in his book, The History of Animals, he has this quote, which says, "So with animals, some spring from parent animals according to their kind, whilst others grow spontaneously and not from kindred stock." Which basically means that some animals grow from other animals, like lions having cubs, but others seem to just pop up out of nowhere or be generated spontaneously. And this was the prevailing view in the scientific community for thousands of years.
The idea of spontaneous generation that Aristotle came up with lasted for thousands of years, from about 322 BC until 1864 AD.
And that's probably an underestimation because Aristotle died in 322 BC, so he probably wrote the book before he died.
And it wasn't until Louis Pasteur contradicted it with his work with the swan neck flasks in 1864 that we came to come up with a new idea of biogenesis.
Which means that spontaneous generation was around for 2,186 years. Biogenesis, on the other hand,
only lasted about 152 years, from 1864 until now. Even though spontaneous generation was the prevalent theory in the 17th century, a chemist, physiologist, and physician by the name of John Baptist van Helmont, who lived in the Netherlands, had to see it for himself.
So van Helmont decided to take a jar and fill it with a soiled cloth and some wheat. And he said that if you took this jar and placed it in a corner and waited 21 days, that suddenly mice would spontaneously generate, almost like a recipe. And he also noted that it was interesting because it wasn't baby mice that were being generated, but full-grown adults. And so this, he thought, was proof that spontaneous generation occurred.
And he found the same results looking at scorpions, and he placed basil in between two bricks in the sunlight, and after a period of time, he would see spontaneous generation of scorpions.
Now we think these theories are silly, but as we've said, Jean-Baptiste van Helmont was a pretty intellectual guy. He, in fact, was the person to bring the word gas into the modern language of science. And he also was considered the founder of pneumatic chemistry. So we want you to pause the video and reflect on, although he was such a smart guy, why may his results in these specific experiments be inaccurate? We've migrated to the kitchen to continue our story about spontaneous generation and the first scientist who actually tried to design an experiment to disprove it. His name was Francesco Redi, and in 1662 he designed an experiment that he thought would disprove spontaneous generation for good.
It had previously been thought that if you left out meat and let it rot, that it would spontaneously generate maggots. So in his experiment, he actually took meat and cut it up into pieces and placed them into jars. The first one he placed in a jar and left it open. The second one he placed in another jar, except this time he closed it. And then he did one more where he put it into a jar, and this time instead of closing the lid on it, he put a piece of cheese paper, in this case we're using wax paper, and he let it set.
His hypothesis was that it wasn't that maggots were being spontaneously generated from the meat, but actually that flies were able to get into the meat and lay their eggs, and those eggs just couldn't be seen by humans. So what he found was that in the closed container, flies were not able to get in. And in the open container, with the cheesecloth on top, flies were also not able to get into the meat, but they were able to fly on top of it, as well as air was able to pass through. In the open container, however, flies were able to get in and land directly on the meat. What he found shouldn't be surprising. On the meat that was left open, maggots grew. So Reddy thought that he had disproven spontaneous generation for good, but not so fast. Next on the scene is a scientist named John Needham, who thought that Reddy, while he had proven that for macroorganisms, or things that we can see, could not be produced by spontaneous generation, maybe microorganisms, or ones that are outside, too small for humans to actually view, could be spontaneously generated. Around this time, Anton von Leeuwenhoek, who you should know as the inventor of the microscope, allowed Needham to look at pond water and see lots of organisms growing. And he hypothesized that those organisms had been spontaneously generated by the pond water itself.
So John Needham came up with an experiment. He took gravy and heated it up in a flask and closed the lid. And he waited, and he found that after a period of time, the gravy would start to, or bacteria would start to form in the gravy. And this proved that maybe, just maybe, spontaneous generation still occurred among very, very small organisms.
So going back to the question that we started with, what happens when scientists get it wrong? We want you to pause the video now and think about what could have been a problem with Needham's experimental design.
It wasn't until 1864 when a chemist/microbiologist by the name of Louis Pasteur introduced a new idea of biogenesis that everyone decided spontaneous generation was just a myth.
And he did this by creating a new type of flask, which he called the swan neck flask, because he thought that it looked like a swan's neck. The problem that most people who were still supporting spontaneous generation thought was that if you sealed a container and didn't allow air to pass through, then some sort of quote-unquote vital principle could be missing, which is why you're not getting any microbes. The swan flask helped this because air was still able to pass through, but the microbes that were present in the air would travel down and get stuck here at the bottom of the neck, not being able to travel up and then down and to contaminate the broth. So Pasteur put some broth, nutrient broth, in a flask with this fancy swan neck. He then boiled the broth to make sure that he had killed all of the microbes that were already present. Once he did that, he waited for a really long time, like over a year, really long time. And after a year, he found that there were still no microbes present in the broth. So what did he do next? He broke off the swan flask so that air could now come directly in, and particles from the air could directly fall into the broth. And he found that, no surprise, microbes began to grow.
Voila.
Voila.
What happens when scientists get it wrong? Is that the question? I gotta restart.